Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Amy Ferrer. I'm the Executive Director of the American Philosophical Association. We're really glad to welcome you to today's APA Live event. This is part of our ongoing series of APA Live virtual events. And this one is co-sponsored by the APA, the Public Philosophy Network, and the Policing Policy and Philosophy Initiative. We're really appreciative of the time that you are taking to be with us today and the time of our panelists. So without further ado, I'll turn things over for a few welcoming comments to Michael Burrows, who's the president of the Public Philosophy Network. Michael.
Thanks so much, Amy. And thank you everybody for being here, and to our panelists for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us today. Just want to say thank you to the American Philosophical Association and the Policing Policy and Philosophy Initiative for their collaboration on putting together this important dialogue and conversation today. The Public Philosophy Network promotes philosophy that engages with issues of civic and public concern, and certainly the issues that we're talking about today are of fundamental import for philosophical and interdisciplinary attention. So glad that we can feature this conversation and be a part of it. I don't want to take time away from this really important conversation, so I'm going to turn it over to Raff Donelson, who will be moderating our conversation today. Thanks so much, Raff, for your service in this role.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Amy. So as Michael mentioned, I'm Raff Donelson. I am associate professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and I'm going to first welcome quickly our fellow panelists. So our panelists include Didier Fassin, who is a professor at the Collège de France, Rachel Harmon, who is a professor at the University of Virginia Law School, Brandon Hogan, who is at Howard, and Luke Hunt, who is at Alabama. So what I'm going to do is just begin with some of the questions that we have and turn it over to our wonderful panel. So the first question I have is totally general. And I just wanted to ask all of you, if you could briefly speak about your approach to an understanding of the optimal role policing should play in our nation. That is kind of what should be the proper function of police.
I'll take a shot at that, Raff. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a very general answer to start off with. So for me, it's very difficult to understand the role of the police without thinking about it in terms of the role of the state and the justification and legitimacy of the state, right? So, I mean, if you think about some of the central ways we justify the state over, say, a state of nature, we think about, well, one, security, and two, governance. So in my view, and again, this is very general. Oh, I thought I heard a question, but this is very general, but I think, we can understand the optimal role of the police as a function of providing security and providing governance, because we entrust the police, we entrust the state to do those things, so we don't have to deal with personal incapacity, bias, and that sort of thing. Now, the tricky part, of course, is less about justifying theoretically an institution like the police and more about the legitimacy side of the police institution. And so, what we're probably going to talk about today, I assume a lot of the issues are going to be breakdowns of legitimacy. So where the police are operating not so much based on authority, but based on, exclusively based on power, based on coercion, that sort of thing. So in my view, the project is to mitigate illegitimacy, not to get rid of the police institution itself, because I think it's justified on grounds of security and governance.
So I can chime in next. I struggle with this question of reform versus abolition. So I think initially I was an abolitionist, and I started thinking, well, you actually an abolitionist because you have a tendency to want to call the police when something serious is happening. So I looked inside, I was like, I'm actually not an abolitionist because I, in some ways, rely on the police to do certain things. I started thinking too, like I'm not a legal positivist. I think there's something to John Austin's notion of what makes a law legitimate. It's like an order backed by threats. So it seems to me, and I may change my mind tomorrow, but it seems to me that there has to be some conception of organized law enforcement if we're going to have a legitimate criminal law. So when I think about the role of the police, I'm thinking about the police serving a necessary function of enforcing the criminal law, but also police interactions with citizens being at a minimal, necessary, only for the worst offenders, and focused on non-lethal enforcement and de-escalation. So I have a notion that we need the police, but they need to have a kind of a minimal role and necessary role.
My definition or conception of the police follows directly from Luke and Brandon's. We all want protection from fear and violence. We all want to use public spaces freely and safely, and we want justice when serious wrongs are done to us. And I think policing is an institutional mechanism for pursuing those ends by leveraging state authority tied to the criminal law to force or compel people to do what they might not want to do towards those ends. And that doesn't presume a particular scope for policing. So the more that we can achieve those ends without state coercion needs justification. And if we can achieve these ends in other ways, then that coercion isn't justified. And even if state coercion is justified, it still needs to be minimally harmful and fairly distributed, both in its costs and its benefits.
Yeah, so perhaps my relationship with policing and the police is slightly different from yours because my work has been done in France, where we have a national police. So that makes a difference, and perhaps I get closer to what Luke said at the beginning of the relationship with the state. And in France, the national police is supposed to be not in the service of the population, but in the service of the state, which is probably a difference with the United States, where the service of the population, which includes the fact that there's a sanction to that, which is the election of the mayor and the power and the municipal authorities. In France, we don't have that at all. The police is national, but the shift that has been observed, and that because I spent 15 months patrolling with the police, and especially the anti-crime units in the area of Paris. The shift that we see is that at the moment in France, and could be the same in other countries, this national police is not in the service of the state, but in the service of the government, and so it becomes, in a certain way, not in the traditional meaning, but it becomes a political police, a police that is in the service of the government. And at the moment we have a right-wing government, so and that's something that you see in many countries where you have a national police.
I think this moves us really nicely into our next question, actually, which is about, there have been a lot of calls recently, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, about radically rethinking the role of police. In the US, this was instigated most poignantly by the Black Lives Matter movement and the 2020 protests over the death of George Floyd, as well as Breonna Taylor. And I was wondering, in light of these kind of radical calls to rethink the role of police in society, movements like defund the police, like police abolitionism, I'm wondering, what is your view on those sorts of movements? What have they gotten right? What have they gotten wrong? What's been effective about them or not effective?
All right, well, I'll chime in. So I think there's something right about defunding police. I mean, I think defunding police is an unfortunate title for just common sense social organizing, right? The idea that if we're fighting crime, we have to fight it at both ends. We have to think about the root causes and also the enforcement of the criminal law. So I just see defund the police as, I guess it should be not called defund the police, but kind of reallocate resources to crime prevention, what I think everybody can get on with. So I think that's right. I think the calls for abolition, someone may be able to point me to the right literature, but I haven't seen any, I guess, plausible understanding of what society would look like with the abolition of police, right? So we ask, well, what will happen to, in this particular case, this heinous case? It seems like we don't get an answer to those questions. And I'd be all for abolishing the police if there was some kind of worked out vision of how we handle the problems that the police currently handle. So to sum up, defund the police, yes. Abolish, I'm kind of waiting to see what it's supposed to look like.
I guess I agree that both the defund movement and the conversations about abolition help both communities and I think individuals imagine alternatives to policing that expand our approaches to public safety. And I think they've generated a lot of creativity on the ground in communities looking for alternatives. And that has been extremely powerful. And by broadening the conversation about how we achieve public safety, I think that enables us to minimize some of the harms and unfairnesses of policing. But I agree with Brandon that it's hard to envision an effective state with no way to stop people from doing what they don't want to do or to compel them to do what they do want to do, because some of our forms of justice, including involve intrusions of either property or bodily integrity or freedom that no one would voluntarily concede. And so I think I haven't seen the alternative to policing that is fully persuasive, but nor have I been disappointed by the movements, because I think that they have opened up people's eyes to what could be possible in the world that we live in that's different from the way we have traditionally done policing for 180 years in this country.
So
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the idea of defunding the police has to be taken into account taken in the context of the increasing of the resources of the police and the prerogatives of the police over time. So defunding would mean to go back to a reasonable amount of resources, weapons, going backward in terms of demilitarization, for example, of the police. So defunding is it could mean not to render the activity of the police impossible because of lack of funds, but precisely to render it more acceptable by the population and more fair, because there would be less of these resources and less of these prerogatives. And also in the specific case of the United States and probably other countries, not mine, there is the question of the police in return to what they get from their local governments, whatever they are, in terms of prerogatives and resources. They pay back in a way by the fines that can constitute a significant part of the budget of a town or a city. So there's this vicious circle that has been working at the detriment of minorities, mostly the working class and racial minorities. And defunding is really trying to change that.
So I think I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to build on one point that I think both Brandon and Rachel made. And so trying to imagine, what abolition would look like. And I think I can come up with maybe, I don't know if this counts, but But let's suppose you kept defunding and defunding and defunding until the state no longer funded the police at all. So it was abolished as a state function, right? So to fill the void there, I mean, you could say, well, we're going to have privatized security. And to me, that's a terrible, terrible idea, primarily because I think, you know, if we entertain that possibility, I think most people in this conference on the panel would probably be fine. We could sort of absorb any cost to pay for a private security force. But the people who are going to be harmed the most are the less affluent, the least affluent, the most disadvantaged. And so philosophically, I think that's extremely problematic. Not to mention, you know, well, I'll stop there. But that was just to try to entertain an option.
I'll add to that it's not
please,
just about privatization, but some of the non-state alternatives to produce public safety raise questions about accountability themselves, which is to say, you know, how do communities aggregate preferences and ensure that non-state alternatives, whether they're privately funded or whether they're publicly funded, receive the kind of community control or community accountability that we might expect when we're talking about the exercise of power.
I think this is actually a really good time then to talk about more general frameworks for assessing policing and public safety more generally. I heard in your remarks, kind of, Rachel, the kind of concern about democracy and legitimacy, and Luke, you as well. And I'm wondering about kind of what are helpful kind of normative frameworks for thinking about what might be the best versions of public safety? Like, are there kind of theoretical resources we can bring to bear to try to solve this practical problem?
I'm gonna say none. And I'll say why. It's not the case that there's nothing wrong with philosophy or theory, but I think it's the case that we have at least nominally an overlapping consensus of what we want. Like, everybody wants to be safe. Everyone wants bad people to face some type of justice. And so the question is going to be, I think, less philosophical and more psychological. Right? So you ask the question, well, why are people opposed to the Affordable Care Act? Do they want to be sick? Like, no, they don't want to be sick. Why is it the case that folks are afraid of, opposed to gun legislation? They don't like getting shot? No, they don't like getting shot. So it seems like, to me, I think that the real thinking has to come in the form of the psychological barrier to reforms, because it seems nominally there's certain things that we just want, but there's a psychological barrier, whether it comes from kind of racialized hatred or jealousy or irrational fears or something like that, that's getting in the way of the things that we want. So I guess what I'm saying is that we've kind of done the philosophy. Now we need to figure out why folks are being irrational.
Yeah, I think I want to say something quickly. I'm going to kind of build on the psychology answer there that Brandon gave. I'm going to go in a kind of a weird direction here, though. So just a quick anecdote to sort of set this up. So when I was at FBI Academy at Quantico, first day of firearms training, you go into a classroom, and there are no guns involved in that situation, but the instructors tell you this metaphor that I know a lot of you have heard. You know, look, society is divided into three segments. You've got the sheep, which is basically all of us in this conference. We're the sheep. And then you've got the wolves who are out there lurking and preying on the sheep, right? And then you've got the people in the classroom at Quantico. Those are the sheep dogs, right? And they're there to go out and hunt in a sort of this heroic battle, the wolves in society. So I think when you talk about reimagining, and this is a very psychological thing, it makes people feel like they're these warriors, and there's all kinds of baggage with that. But I think when you talk about reimagining public safety, I mean, one thing is to say, look, this is not just a silly metaphor, but it's a thoroughly problematic conception of who the police are as being distinct from the community, at this very individuated sort of warrior guardian class that is set apart from the community. So that's something that's from within the academies and police training that I think should be reimagined, but it's very difficult because police love to think of themselves as Rambo or a warrior or something like that.
So I guess I have a different take to go back to your question on, you asked about our framework for either assessing policing or measuring how we're doing. And I don't think we have a singular normative framework for assessing policing. From a philosophical point of view, we're worried about justification, and that might mean both harm efficiency and fairness, both from the benefits and the costs. But from a legal point of view, we're worried about legality, right? We want to know that policing is legal. We want to know that policing adheres to the basic premises of procedural justice. Well, that's not either. If that's a social psychological either account, or it's a philosophical account about our relationship to the state, depending on which kind of procedural justice you're talking about. There are a bunch of different ways, different metrics by which we can assess policing, and it's a very difficult thing to meet all those metrics.
Yeah.
And we haven't integrated them that well. I mean, one of the things is that we don't actually have a really good framework. There are no studies, for example, that assess whether a particular policing practice increases or reduces legality by officers, increases or reduces crime, increases or reduces community experience, is financially viable, or we have no study, literally no study that assesses any practice by 3 or 4 of these measures, much less all of them.
Well, I'm not sure I completely agree with what has been said until now. First of all, I think there are studies about the effects of comparing the effect either before, after, or here and there, comparing when some changes have been implemented in policing in some cities. But probably you're right that there should be more, and that should be a real concern when at the moment it's more the exception, and there are only a few examples. These examples being very convincing about how you can change the fairness and the efficacy of policing by when you measure it after changing some practices. But on the question of the psychology, of course there is psychology, but behind psychology, I think there's power relation, there's racial inequality, there's so when you say, Brandon, that it's irrational, I don't think it's completely irrational. I think the people who are for a strong police and at whatever cost, I think they're rational from their perspective, maybe not from the perspective of society, but from their perspective, because they're simply following their interest, and they will not be, or their children are not concerned by the consequence of this policing. I've been struck by the fact that in a slightly different domain, that of justice and criminal justice, that the fact that there has been an interest in reforming the penal system in the United States, in 25 states, I think, at the moment, when instead of having African-American Black kids being arrested for drugs, it has become more and more white kids. And then people started to think that they had interest in changing the law, whereas they had no interest before, or their interest was probably not in favor of Black people. So So I think the psychology, as you say, is very important, but behind the psychology, there's history and politics. But probably we don't disagree on that.
Yeah, I think we agree. I mean, obviously, there's different notions of rationality. There's kind of rationality given what I know, and then there's the rationality given my overall interest. Because obviously, devoting money to crime prevention, kind of upstream crime prevention, downstream crime prevention makes sense for everybody. Because you want the person who broke in your house to be arrested, maybe, but you want less people trying to break into your house. But yeah, so I think we agree. Kind of, we said just two separate conceptions of what's rational.
The only thing I would just refine what I was trying to say, which is there are multiple metrics, and it is very hard to assess police practices against all of those metrics. So when we look, it's not that there isn't good research on policing. There's actually quite a bit of research, and it's really expanded in the last decade. Criminologists have expanded the kinds of metrics they've used to assess these practices. They're looking much more at racial disparities and about how communities experience the practices, which matters enormously. It's just very hard to assess those kinds of issues and effectiveness and legality in the same study. We just don't have all the metrics together. And that's partly because we're measuring policing by a lot of, I think Brandon raised this, we have a lot of overlapping interests in policing and a lot of different ways of assessing whether it's doing what we want it to do.
Since a few of you mentioned race, I thought it was important to ask, what role should race play in assessing the justice of policing in general, the justice of policing in America with its racial history? Like, what role should race play as we think about policing issues?
Yeah, I think it should be central in the sense of, I mean, Congress was only talking about police reform and police abolition because innocent Black people were getting killed in the streets at an alarming rate. So I mean, I think the racial aspects of policing have to be one metric if we're thinking about when we have a successful police practice in the United States. But also that we have to use the race to assess the barriers to reforming the police. So Raff, I don't know if you remember this. We were at a conference again. Well, you remember the conference, but the conference in St. Louis. Part of the conference was in a prison. The second part was at St. Louis University. So the first part of the conference, we're at kind of a conference led by inmates in the prison. The prisoners were allowed to take a philosophy course in order to gain college credit. And one of the organizers told us, well, we organized this program to allow these inmates to gain college credit. And the guards, who are mostly white, got jealous, upset. They thought, this is unfair. How can it be the case these people are allowed to get college credits and I can't? So they only were allowed to kind of keep the program going that they offered it to the guards as well. So you ask the guards, well, why is it the case that you're upset about someone getting college credit? Because the person with a college degree is less likely to be back in here, less likely to do something to your family. And the answer has to be, I don't want Black folks to get stuff. I'm mad if Black folks get stuff and I don't get it, right? So I think even assessing the barriers have to take race into account. So yeah, I don't think there's any way to think about policing and not think about race.
Even if in the abstract, in some imaginary world, we could not think about race. In our world, in the United States, we have racial disparities at every level in policing, from who gets encountered voluntarily, who gets stopped, who gets searched, who gets arrested, who gets force used against them, who gets killed. The disparities are so thick and so consistent that we can't. They vary across communities, they vary in their severity, but we can't separate out race from any aspect of how we think about the justification for the project we're engaged in. So I don't see how we could separate conversations about race and policing in the United States.
Yeah, I 100% agree with both Brandon and Rachel here, and I'll try to say something a little bit different because I don't want to just repeat what you guys said. So one thing I'll add, and this is not lost on anyone in the conference. So race is central. There's no doubt that there's a racism problem in policing. The other thing that, Black Lives Matters did such a fantastic job of highlighting is this disparity in killings, right? So people are killed, homicides by the police based on skin color, and that disproportionate effect. And one thing that I think is a sort of a different metric or different thing that's part of the conversation is the vast majority of people who are killed by the police, vast majority, I don't have the statistics right here, are of a particular socioeconomic class, right? So there's a particular class element involved here. So for example, we don't see a lot of professors or doctors or lawyers, we'll find exceptions, of course, that are being killed by the police, white or Black. So one component is the class element, but racism is central. And then the last thing I'll say about racism, because I think this gets, people talk past each other, not in this group, but in sort of internet world and that sort of thing. So I was an FBI agent for 7 years. I worked with state police, local police, city police, sheriff's office, all kinds of police. I can't recall one time during that 7 years where a police officer used a racial slur. Now, I do know though, that many, many times officers, and this is true across the board, will respond to people based on fear because they look different, because you see someone on a different skin color and you're scared. And that affects that encounter. Now, is that racism? Yes, it is. Now, it's different than perhaps saying, using a racial slur. And so one thing that I think is lost in the bigger conversation out on pundits and stuff is, sometimes the police say, why are you screaming at me and calling me a racist? I don't use those words. Well, there are other ways to be racist, and let me tell you about that. And so that's a piece of it as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And Rachel, what you say about the United States, unfortunately, is true in most countries, as far as I know. Of course, who are the minorities and what kind of poor socioeconomic class there is might differ from one country to another. But I did the first because it's illegal research on the ethno-racial distribution in prison in France, and 77% of people, of whom 80% were French, so they were not foreigners, they were not migrants, they were French. 77% of them were either Black or Arab or Roma. So and in a prison. So so unfortunately, what you describe is true in many countries in the world at different degrees. What I found very interesting in the case of the United States is that how let's say, to simplify, the white majority discovered what was happening in Black neighborhoods after the death of Michael Brown and many others after. And what was very remarkable, I think, was that people from these neighborhoods said how much they knew about it, how much they had known for a long time, and they were not heard about what they had to say. So for me, that was really that went against the false consciousness argument, and it was on the contrary. There was an awareness. It's simply that this awareness was not taken into account. So having consideration for the perspective of those who are not necessarily killed, fortunately, but who are targeted by the police, this is something something important. And whereas as you said, look, the police may not use racist slurs. There is a difference between individual racism and institutional racism, and the way the defense of the police institution, by saying when there's a problem, they are the bad apples, is really ignoring institutional racism that exists in many of your policies, I suppose, and in my country as well.
Luke, I do not have that experience, but because I am probably not a federal law enforcement agent. I want to just remind the audience that they can ask questions in the chat. I see a couple of those are coming in. I'll ask one more question and turn to some of those questions that have been asked, but keep asking them, audience members. The last question that I have for all of you panelists is, could you talk a little bit about how your views about policing interact with your views about other things about the criminal justice system? So how does it interact with your views about, say, criminal sentencing, or your views about, say, bail, or your views about the proper norms of criminal prosecutions? Like, how do your views affect any of that sort of other stuff in the criminal justice system?
It probably, I think my views on policing probably give me a lot of distrust for a lot of the other institutions. Even if the institutional design is correct, it seems like if you start off where most people's encounter with the criminal justice system is the police, if that first encounter is bad, it seems like everything after is going to be problematic. So you have police have incentives to lie, incentives to lie, to make up stories, to talk about incidents in a way that fits into certain language that will allow them to escape liability. And that transfers over to prosecutors working with police, taking police's word for it, juries having kind of a robust trust in the police. So I guess we can think about this metaphorically. Like if the first encounter is problematic, it seems like the rest of the encounters are going to be tainted by that first encounter. And anybody that knows me knows I have like zero love for individual police officers, police forces. There's always active antagonism. If I have to encounter them on the streets, I have just a robust distrust of any police officer. Even though I think the notion of police is necessary for a well-ordered society, it's on site every time I see a police officer. I just don't have any trust. So that lack of trust, I think, transfers to any system that the police are, I guess, the starting point of.
I think that first of all, we have to be aware, we are, but I mean, more generally, people have to be aware that there's an affinity between police and prosecutors, and more generally between those who enforce order and those who are in the criminal justice system. The prosecutors, they need the police. They need the police to bring them the criminals, and so there's, and it's not just a utilitarian necessity to have these criminals being brought to them, but it's also they work together. They have exchanges, so they build sympathy between among them, which contributes to the form of untouchability of police officers, even when they kill someone. And we know these statistics about how exceptional it is that a grand jury will decide to go to the court when a police officer kills shoots someone and kills that person. So I think there's we have really to think the links at different levels, institutional, but also even friendliness they have among them. And the other thing is related to that. I'm a part of a commission to reform the penal and penitentiary system in a state in the United States. And what strikes me is that almost everything can be discussed. That is the law, the prisons, but not policing. So whereas we know how much policing is the first step to go to end up in front of a judge and then to in a prison, but this is the only institution that is not touched.
So I guess I would answer that in two ways. One is, I think it's really critical not to view policing mostly in connection with the rest of the criminal justice system. That is to say, that is one aspect of policing, but much of policing never connects back to an arrest, a prosecution, a conviction, a sentencing, and the like. And so policing is much more expansive. It is much more in the community than other aspects of criminal justice, and we need to not evaluate it only in that connection. But of course it is connected, and that matters. I don't know if this is policing making me think differently about criminal justice or criminal justice making me think differently about policing, but I was a prosecutor for 8 years at the Department of Justice, specializing in civil rights prosecutions, which included a lot of hate crimes and also police misconduct and corrections misconduct, other official violence. And I started to get cynical about the role of criminal prosecutions in addressing problems in policing, because it felt like sometimes a criminal prosecution could actually contribute to a department, for example, saying, well, they prosecuted the bad apple and now we're good to go, not acknowledging the role that the department plays. Nobody's born a bad police officer, right? Not acknowledging the role the department plays in causing police misconduct. And so I became cynical about criminal prosecution. And one of the reasons I came to academia was to explore the role that law plays in shaping police conduct beyond criminal prosecution. And then Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, and people marched in the street, and they didn't say reform police departments now. They demanded justice, by which they meant the criminal prosecution of police officers involved in a deadly violence. And this was not just true in Ferguson, it was true around the country. And that reminded me of my experience working with victims of police misconduct and other crimes, who experienced the fact of criminal prosecution as a form of respect for the harm that had been done to them. And so I guess when I think about policing now, in connection with criminal prosecution, I think of it on both sides, both the potential prosecution of officers and the importance of showing respect for victims, and also the importance of a well-ordered, fair, and functioning criminal justice system to show respect for the victims of other kinds of violence, which we currently have only in a very broken sense.
I'll be very brief. I agree with all of that, and I especially do think policing is unique. One area where I think there is some commonality that I'm interested in is sort of the norms of bargains, and we can draw on the resources of the contract law for that. So as an FBI agent, I was required to run informants, and as most people know, you have tremendous amount of leverage over an informant. You can basically get them to put themselves in a life or death situation, because they're willing to do anything to stay out of jail or reduce their time in prison. And I think some of those kinds of agreements are unconscionable, they lack good faith, they're in some cases fraudulent. And I think there's parallels in other areas of criminal justice. I mean, we could, of course, think about something like the plea agreement process. And oftentimes we know that some people plead guilty to crimes they did not commit. Now, why is that? Well, it may be rational. It may be that the government has tremendous leverage. And I'm not suggesting that we throw out plea agreements. I'm just suggesting that there are these norms of interactions with the state that raise very important problems, both in policing and maybe something like the prosecutorial level as well.
All right, there are a lot of good questions in the chat, and so I thought I'd just throw out one and hopefully get to all of them. So the first one I wanted to get at, one of the first ones, was about what do you think that, or maybe here's the best way to ask it. Do academicians, like all of us, have any special role to play in virtue of our institutional placement in advocating for particular policies or changes to how policing works? And how does thinking about policing as a kind of academician, as either as a law professor or a philosopher, how does that enrich kind of philosophy or legal thought more generally?
I would say our role, I think, is very limited. We should be extremely modest in what the impact we can have. I have participated in several commissions and reports and at the national level in France, and it would be difficult to say that it had any impact. By which I don't mean to be discouraging. I think the work we do is important in terms of producing knowledge, understanding, evidence, and all of you, as I understand, along the conversation, have an experience of being both academics and in the broader criminal system before, but I think as academics we should be very engaged and at the same time very modest.
I'll agree with that. I think Didier pointed out that we can contribute knowledge, we can contribute evidence, we can also contribute analysis, analytic clarity that I think the people involved in the criminal justice system don't have time or space or resources to do. And so I think academics do play an important role, but it's a modest one, and yet it's a role. I mean, it's what we do. I think it's critically important, even if it's not always directly impactful.
Yeah, I think I'll add, I mean, it seems to be the case that there probably should be some segment of us that kind of jump ship, leave the academy and go work in a political campaign, do policy stuff, just stuff that's more direct. Because obviously there's a lot of people who are finishing grad school with PhDs and not enough jobs for them. So I think maybe the persons on this panel who are lucky enough to get jobs, I don't have any conception that I'm about to change the world, but it seems that there's enough people who have academic training who can actually be in the positions where somebody's actually listening to them. Because I don't think, I mean, y'all listening to me, but nobody's really listening to us that much.
Yeah, I'll just echo what everyone said. I think what the primary function is, we can provide clarity, we can articulate the problems, the questions, provide evidence, and that is hopefully illuminating both in the teaching role or in the publishing role. Again, very minor, very modest, but it's something, I suppose.
I think one of the most interesting things about the conversation in the United States really after 2015 with the death of Eric Garner and Michael Brown is that people were reaching out to academics. You know, I used to get calls all the time about the latest police shooting because they wanted the quote that said it was going to be hard to prosecute the officer. And they just were asking me for the same quote each time. And then after 2015, I felt like the conversation changed and people were asking bigger questions in communities and looking to academics to help answer those questions. And then in an extreme way after 2020, where people were now calling for media, for media requests that involved the history of federal grant programs into police departments, or all sorts of bigger questions that are now on the table in the public conversation. And so to the degree that academics play a role, that I think that role has expanded as the public conversation about policing has gotten far more sophisticated and itself has expanded.
Great. There's a question that's actually addressed directly to you, Brandon. So some people do want to hear what you have to say, but the rest of the panelists can answer this as well. Earlier in the conversation, I think after the first question, you said that you think that a police force is necessary for a well-ordered society, and the audience member asked, could you say more about why you think a police force is necessary for a well-ordered society? And again, this is open to others as well.
If I may just, the question is also, what is a well-ordered society?
That's certainly part of it, but the main question was just, why is a police force specifically necessary for a well-ordered society? Like, what is it about a well-ordered society that requires police?
Yeah, so I'm still thinking through this, but it seems to me there may be either practical or analytic connection between like criminal law and law enforcement. So maybe it's a limitation of imagination, but I just can't imagine having a need for a criminal law, not having some state-sponsored law enforcement. So it's not spectacular. It's just more it seems to me there's a kind of analytic connection. And obviously there's many ways to think about what law enforcement looks like. But when I say police are necessary, I'm just thinking there needs to be some organized conception of law enforcement for the state to function.
Yeah, I think when we think of order in society, from a police perspective, we think of public order. We think of not having crime all over, or if there are crime, people being arrested, etc. What many studies have shown, and that's what I found in my book, Enforcing Order, is that instead of in the disadvantaged neighborhoods, instead of maintaining public order, they are maintaining a social order. They are maintaining an order of these kids have to learn what their place in society is, and this is what we're going to teach them by by checking them and by having all these harassment and this is, I think, a very significant shift when instead of public order you go to social order, and this has been told to me by high officials also in the police system, saying that we know that when we send certain units, there will be more disorder after their intervention than there is before, because of the violence, because of the and so on the one hand there's more disorder, more public disorder in certain cases, but on the other hand there's more social order.
If others don't want to jump in, there are more questions. So one of the other questions, if folks aren't going to jump in on this difficult thing, is a question about police hiring. And so the question essentially asks, there are a couple of different kinds of problems with police hiring. One problem with police hiring is that currently many police departments, especially in the US, are understaffed. and a number of police departments have officers who are taking various leaves of office, maybe because of lots of public debate about the role of police. And on the other hand, there's questions about what kind of things departments should be looking for when they're hiring new police officers. Should there be certain types of training that should be available? Are we worried about the kinds of people who are interested in becoming police? Maybe they're drawn to policing for all of the wrong reasons. And so I guess this question is asking, do you have thoughts about the staffing of police, the hiring of police, hiring practices, and what could make those processes better?
Yeah, I have thoughts. I'm trying to figure out how to say them in ways that don't get me in trouble. So I think Rachel may be able to correct me, but I remember reading a federal case where a police officer took issue with, no, a potential police officer took issue with the department's using IQ tests as a criteria for hiring. So it wasn't the case that the police officer had to get over a certain score to be hired, but if a police officer or a potential officer scored too high, they would disqualify from being on the police force. And the federal court says, yeah, that's fine, because if you're too smart, you're not going to be excited about doing beat work. Like, we don't want someone that has these cognitive abilities. That always struck me as crazy, but it makes sense that there's a certain type of person that you want that's going to run into the fire and do these types of things. And I don't know what to do about that, because nobody on this call, I don't think anybody that's listening is going to intentionally sign up to be in a local police department, because it's not rewarding, it's not fun, it's dangerous. And it seems that the folks who have more options are going to take those options. And this is a problem. This is something I think about. I don't know what to do about it. It's kind of, you have a job that the people who want to do it have a lot of incentives not to do it. So I guess I'm I guess not answering, but setting up a problem that I don't know how to solve.
Different ways to think about hiring. We have to think about who we're screening out and who we're screening in, right? And in encouraging the kinds of people we want involved in policing, we want people with good communication skills, people who are good problem solvers, people who have empathy and can maintain empathy over years. I don't think that policing is actually not a rewarding job. I think many people find it very rewarding. They find it a way to contribute to their communities, but it depends how we conceive of policing. And I think it's much more challenging now to conceive of the positive components of policing, which is partly why I think departments are struggling to recruit new officers. And then the challenges and the kinds of accountability that police officers sometimes face is partly why we have trouble retaining existing officers. I think hiring is a complicated issue, but I think one of the things we have to remember is that we don't have police officers. We can't screen out some of the problems in policing. We make those problems after people are hired, in the way we run departments, in their culture, in their training, in what we reward and what we punish. And so we have to conceive of hiring in conjunction with all of the rest of the policies and supervision and equipment and practices that we engage in that shape the content of policing on the street.
I'll just answer very, very briefly. So, we're talking about how, a lot of people that we don't want in the job are drawn to this job. And I think that's right. I think Brandon mentioned that. And I just saw in the chat, someone popped up that police reform needs to involve professional development. And, unfortunately, a lot of times it's like the opposite. It's like professional undevelopment, right? So some police departments are adamant that they send their officers on these sort of in-service trainings that are taught by private police instructors to teach them how to be a warrior, to teach them how to act and use force and violence reflexively, to teach them that they are sort of superheroes. And so departments are paying for that sort of thing. So it's crucial that we move away from that, because that's professional undevelopment, and in my opinion. So it's pretty bad actually once you get in as well.
So we are just at about time, just over time, in fact. So I want to thank our wonderful panelists for an engaging discussion about policing, and turn things over to Amy.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to share another slide here. Thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today, and to all of you in the audience who've been participating really actively. It's great. I want to point you to some additional resources. So, of course, this is co-sponsored by the Public Philosophy Network. The URL for that organization is on your screen, and they have a conference coming up. We also have the link for that. There's a blog post on the APA blog about the Policing Policy and Philosophy Initiative. And I want to point you to upcoming APA Live events, one next week on philosophy and activism that's free and open to the public, and then a member exclusive event on strategies for student engagement on April 26th. Finally, our panelists have graciously shared their contact information if you'd like to follow up with questions after the event. So that's on your screen. We hope you'll suggest topics for future APA Live events. And if you want to support our work, please be a member, please make a donation. It helps us to continue having these kinds of events and doing all the work that the APA does. So thanks again to all of our panelists. Thanks to PPN and the 3PI for co-sponsoring, and we look forward to seeing everyone at another future APA Live event. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.